Hi, my curious and lovely friends. Welcome to Happy Sleep. Before we dive into today's absolutely mind-bending journey, I want you to do something for me real quick. Just 3 tiny clicks that'll take you less than 5 seconds. First, hit that like button if you're even remotely curious about what I'm about to share. Second, if you haven't joined our little community of future thinkers yet, smash that subscribe button so you never miss these wild rides through possibility. And third, and this is the fun part, drop a comment below telling me where you are in the world right now and what time it is as you're watching this. I love seeing these conversations unfold across time zones and continents. Are you watching this at 2 a.m. in Tokyo, mid-morning coffee break in London, late-night snack in New York? Let me know. Now picture this with me. You're walking through what looks like an ordinary zoo on a crisp autumn afternoon. You can smell the earth and grass, hear distant calls that sound almost familiar but not quite. You round a corner and there, standing in a vast enclosure that stretches to the horizon, its shaggy coat rippling in the breeze, its curved tusks catching the light, is a woolly mammoth. Not a robot covered in fake fur. Not a CGI projection on a screen. An actual breathing, living mammoth, reaching down with its trunk to pull up tufts of grass, its small, intelligent eyes blinking as it watches a butterfly flutter past. Your heart stops. Your brain short-circuits, because this animal has been extinct for over 4,000 years. And yet, here it is, alive. Now before your mind jumps to DNA cloning or Jurassic Park scenarios, because we've all seen those movies, let me stop you right there. This isn't about extracting ancient DNA from frozen bones and trying to Frankenstein a creature back into existence. That's the old way of thinking, the biological way. Today, we're going to explore something far stranger, far more profound. What if I told you that future physicists might resurrect extinct species not by rebuilding their bodies, but by recreating their very existence, their consciousness, their behavior, their essence, using the bizarre, counterintuitive rules of quantum mechanics? What if the woolly mammoth, the saber-toothed tiger, the dodo bird, even creatures we've never seen like dinosaurs, could live again not as flesh and blood, but as perfectly sentient digital beings in what we might call a quantum zoo? This sounds like science fiction, I know. It sounds like I've been reading too many comic books or watching too many late-night conspiracy theory videos. But stick with me here, because the science backing this up is real. It's happening right now in labs around the world, and it's pointing toward possibilities that will fundamentally change how we understand life, consciousness, and what it means to exist. We're going to dive deep like Mariana Trench deep into the intersection of quantum physics, biology, computer science, and philosophy. And I'm going to explain every single piece of it in the simplest, most down-to-earth way possible, because this stuff is too important and too fascinating to be locked away behind academic jargon. So let's start at the very beginning. What exactly is quantum mechanics? Most people hear that term and their eyes glaze over. They picture chalkboards covered in impossible math equations or scientists in lab coats talking about parallel universes. But quantum mechanics is just the name we give to the set of rules that describe how the tiniest things in our universe behave. Things smaller than atoms, like electrons and photons. And here's the crazy part. These tiny things don't follow the same rules as the big objects in our everyday world. They live in a reality that seems completely bonkers to us, but it's the most fundamental reality. Let me give you a simple analogy to wrap your head around this. Imagine you're flipping a coin. In our everyday world, the coin is either heads or tails while it's in the air. It's just that we don't know which until it lands. But in the quantum world, that coin would literally be both heads and tails at the same time until you look at it. The act of looking, of measuring, of observing, that's what forces it to choose one state or the other. This isn't just a metaphor. This is how particles actually behave. They exist in what's called a superposition of states, meaning all possibilities exist simultaneously until observation collapses them into one reality. It's called superposition, and it's the first key concept you need to understand. Think of it like this. You're watching a movie, but instead of the film playing frame by frame in order, every single frame exists on the screen at once, overlapping and transparent until you press play. And then suddenly, one frame becomes solid and real, and the rest disappear. That's what particles do. They're in all states at once until something interacts with them strongly enough to force them into one specific state. This isn't philosophical mumbo-jumbo. We have experiments that prove this beyond any doubt, like the famous double-slit experiment, which shows that particles can interfere with themselves as if they were waves, which only makes sense if they're going through both slits simultaneously. Now, the second key concept is entanglement, and this is where things get really weird and really exciting for our quantum zoo idea. Entanglement happens when two particles interact in such a way that they become linked, forever connected across space and time. If you entangle two particles and then separate them by the entire width of the universe, measuring one particle instantly affects the other. Not at the speed of light, faster than that, instantaneously. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance, and he hated it because it seemed to violate everything he thought he understood about reality. But it's real. We've tested it. We've proven it. And it might be the key to understanding not just physics, but life itself. Here's a simple way to think about entanglement. Imagine you have two magical dice. You roll one die in New York and your friend rolls the other die in Paris. Normally, the dice would show random numbers, but these are entangled dice. Whatever number you roll in New York, your friend's die in Paris will instantly show the matching number every single time without any communication between them. They're not sending signals. They're not using secret codes. They're simply two parts of a single, unified system that stretches across space. The dice are, in a very real sense, not two separate objects, but one object that happens to exist in two places at once until you measure them. Now, why does any of this matter for resurrecting extinct species? Because what if consciousness itself, what if life itself, relies on these quantum phenomena? What if the reason a mammoth is more than just a collection of cells and chemical reactions is because there's a quantum component to its existence, a level of reality that we can't see with our eyes or measure with conventional instruments? But that makes the difference between a living, breathing creature and a perfect but lifeless copy. This is where we start venturing into territory that makes mainstream scientists uncomfortable, but where some of the most revolutionary ideas are being explored right now. Let me back up and talk about what we know about life and consciousness, because we need to understand the problem before we can see how quantum physics might offer a solution. What makes something alive? This seems like a simple question, but scientists have been arguing about it for centuries. Is a virus alive? It has genetic material, it evolves, it reproduces after a fashion, but it can't do anything on its own. It has to hijack the machinery of a living cell. Is fire alive? It consumes fuel, it grows, it reproduces by spreading, it responds to its environment. But we don't consider fire to be alive. So what's the difference? Most biologists today define life by a set of characteristics: organization, cells and structures; metabolism, taking in energy and using it; homeostasis, maintaining internal balance; growth, reproduction, response to stimuli, and evolution. But this is just a checklist. It doesn't tell us what the essence of life is. It's like defining a car by saying it has wheels, an engine, doors, and seats. That's true, but it doesn't capture what a car is or why it moves. And when we get to consciousness, things get even murkier. Consciousness is the most familiar thing in the world to each of us. It's our own subjective experience, the feeling of being you, the sensation of seeing red, the taste of chocolate, the pain of a stubbed toe. But it's also the most mysterious phenomenon in the universe. We have no idea why or how physical processes in the brain produce subjective experience. This is what philosopher David Chomke has called the hard problem of consciousness. We can map every neuron, understand every chemical reaction, trace every electrical impulse, and we still can't explain why there should be any inner experience at all. Why aren't we just biological robots processing information without any awareness? Why does it feel like something to be alive? This is where quantum consciousness theories come in. The most famous is called UCHA, which stands for Orchestrated Objective Reduction, developed by physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Himcroft. The basic idea is that consciousness emerges from quantum processes happening inside tiny structures in our brain cells called microtubules. Microtubules are like the skeleton of a cell. They're tiny tubes made of protein that give cells their shape, transport materials around, and play a crucial role in cell division. But Penrose and Himcroft proposed that they might be doing something far more profound. They might be tiny quantum computers, maintaining quantum coherence and performing calculations that give rise to consciousness. Now, mainstream neuroscience has largely rejected this idea, and for good reason. The brain is warm, wet, and chaotic, exactly the kind of environment where quantum effects should be destroyed almost instantly. Quantum computers we build in labs need to be cooled to near absolute zero, isolated from all vibration and electromagnetic noise, because any disturbance collapses their delicate quantum states. How could microtubules in a warm, noisy brain possibly maintain quantum coherence, long enough to do anything useful? But here's where recent discoveries are turning this skepticism on its head. Researchers at Huck University published a groundbreaking study in 2025 showing that living organisms might be using quantum superchromatoins, where molecules work together to amplify quantum effects, to process information billions of times faster than we previously thought possible. They focused on tryptophan, an amino acid found in many proteins, which forms networks in structures like microtubules. These networks can maintain quantum coherence at biological temperatures, processing light energy in trillionths of a second. Even simple organisms like bacteria and fungi appear to use these quantum mechanisms. This suggests that life might have evolved ways to harness quantum effects that we don't yet understand, using the warm, noisy environment to its advantage rather than being destroyed by it. Think of it like this. We thought quantum effects in biology were like trying to have a delicate conversation in the middle of a rock concert. Impossible. But what if life evolved noise-canceling headphones? What if the very chaos we thought would destroy quantum coherence is actually part of how it's maintained and amplified? This is still highly controversial, but the evidence is mounting that quantum biology is real and important. So let's connect this back to our quantum zoo. If consciousness and the essence of life do involve quantum processes that we don't fully understand yet, then simply rebuilding a mammoth's DNA and growing a body wouldn't be enough. You'd get a perfect biological replica, but it might be like an incredibly sophisticated robot, doing everything a mammoth would do but with no body home inside. No subjective experience, no inner mammothness, no spark of mammoth consciousness. It would be a philosophical zombie, acting alive but not truly living. But what if we could simulate not just the biology, but the quantum level of reality? What if we could create a quantum simulation that captures not just the physical mammoth, but the quantum information patterns that made a mammoth a mammoth? This is where things get really wild and exciting. Let's talk about what quantum simulation actually means, because this is a term that gets thrown around a lot. In a regular computer simulation, you use bits, zeros and ones, to represent the state of a system and calculate how it changes over time. You can simulate a hurricane, a galaxy, or a mammoth herd this way, but you're always approximating. You're taking a continuous, complex reality and chopping it up into discrete pieces. It's like trying to capture the ocean in a bucket made of pixels. You can get close, but you'll never have the real thing. A quantum simulation, on the other hand, uses qubits, quantum bits that can exist in superposition and become entangled. Instead of approximating reality with discrete bits, you're using the actual building blocks of reality to model a system. If you want to simulate a quantum system, like a molecule, or maybe like consciousness, a quantum computer can do it naturally and efficiently in ways that classical computers fundamentally cannot. This is what Richard Feynman realized back in 1982. Some problems are just too complex for regular computers, because the amount of information you need to track grows exponentially. But quantum computers can handle that exponential growth because they exist in that exponential space naturally. Let me give you a concrete example to make this tangible. Imagine you're trying to simulate a simple molecule with 100 atoms. Each atom has electrons, and each electron can be in many different states. To fully describe this molecule on a classical computer, you'd need to track about 2 to the power of 100 pieces of information. That's a number so huge it exceeds the number of atoms in the observable universe. No classical computer, no matter how big, could ever do it. But a quantum computer with just 100 qubits could simulate this molecule naturally, because those qubits can exist in all possible states simultaneously. The quantum computer isn't calculating every possibility one by one. It's living all possibilities at once, just like the real molecule does. Now, a mammoth is vastly more complex than a simple molecule. It's made of trillions of cells, each containing billions of molecules, all interacting in incredibly complex ways. But here's the thing. If consciousness involves quantum processes, then the essence of mammoth-ness might be encoded in quantum information patterns that are actually much more compact than the full biological description. Think of it like the difference between a photograph and a hologram. A photograph captures every pixel of light, but damage the photo and you lose part of the image forever. A hologram, though, encodes the entire image in every piece of it. If you break a hologram into pieces, each piece still contains the whole picture, just fuzzier. Quantum information might work like that hologram, with the essence of the mammoth encoded in a pattern that can be simulated more efficiently than you'd think. So let's imagine, step by step, how we might actually create a quantum zoo. What would the technology look like? What would we need to know? What are the challenges we'd face? First, we'd need to understand the quantum signature of life. We'd need to map how quantum processes contribute to consciousness and biological function. This would involve studying living organisms at the quantum level, not just microtubules, but all the other structures that might maintain quantum coherence. We'd need to understand how quantum information flows through a living system, how it's encoded, how it's protected from decoherence, and how it gives rise to subjective experience. This is the holy grail of quantum biology, and we're only at the very beginning of this journey. But let's say we figure it out. Let's say we discover that consciousness does indeed have a quantum component, and we can measure it and map it. Then what? Well, next we'd need to somehow capture the quantum signature of extinct species. This is where things get really interesting, because we can't exactly go back in time and put a mammoth brain in a quantum scanner, but we might be able to reconstruct that signature from other sources. Think about what we know about mammoths. We have their DNA preserved in frozen specimens. We have their bones, their tusks, their frozen bodies. We have cave paintings made by humans who saw them. We have isotopic analyses of their tusks that tell us where they traveled, what they ate, how they lived. A 2024 study published in Science reconstructed the entire life journey of a female woolly mammoth by analyzing isotopes in her tusk. They could track her movements across Alaska, see that she preferred highland habitats, understand her dietary patterns. Another 2023 study in Nature found testosterone surges in mammoth tusks, proving that male mammoths went through musth, those periods of intense sexual aggression, just like modern elephants. We know so much about how they lived, how they behaved, what their social structures might have been like. If we combine all this data, genetic, isotopic, behavioral, environmental, we might be able to create a computational model of a mammoth that's accurate down to the cellular level. And if we understand quantum biology, we might be able to infer the quantum processes that would have been happening in that mammoth's brain and body. It's like being a detective at a crime scene where the crime happened 10,000 years ago, and the only evidence is what's been preserved in ice and rock. But quantum information might leave more traces than we think. Subtle patterns in the DNA, in the protein structures, in the way isotopes were metabolized. All of these might reflect the underlying quantum processes. Now, let's talk about what this simulation would actually look like. Would it be like a video game? Would the mammoths be aware they were in a simulation? These are profound philosophical questions we need to grapple with. There's a concept in philosophy called substrate independence. It suggests that consciousness isn't about what you're made of, biological neurons, silicon chips, quantum circuits, but about how information is processed. If you can replicate the right kind of information processing, consciousness should emerge regardless of the physical substrate. This is the idea behind mind uploading, where you scan a brain and recreate its function in a computer. Most people think of this in terms of classical computers, but if consciousness requires quantum processes, then you'd need a quantum computer to do it properly. So in our quantum zoo, the mammoths wouldn't be trapped in a video game. They would be genuinely living their mammoth lives, experiencing mammoth consciousness, processing information in mammoth ways. The simulation wouldn't be something we watch from outside, it would be their reality. Their subjective experience would be as real to them as our reality is to us. We might be able to observe certain aspects of it, measure certain outputs, but their inner world would be their own. This raises huge ethical questions. If we create a quantum simulation of a mammoth that is genuinely conscious, what are our responsibilities? Is it okay to create such a being if we can't provide it with the full, rich environment it would have had? A mammoth in the Pleistocene wasn't just an individual. It was part of a herd, part of an ecosystem, part of a complex web of relationships with other mammoths, with predators, with the environment. If we simulate a solitary mammoth, are we creating a form of cosmic cruelty? Are we condemning a conscious being to a lonely existence? Maybe we'd need to simulate entire ecosystems. Not just mammoths, but the plants they ate, the wolves that hunted them, the climate they lived in. We'd need to simulate the quantum signatures of entire ecosystems, creating a self-consistent quantum world where these beings could live full, authentic lives. This would be unbelievably complex, requiring quantum computers far beyond anything we have today. But the theoretical framework suggests it's possible. Let's talk about the technology we'd need, because this is important for understanding whether this is science fiction or something that might actually happen. Today's quantum computers are still in their infancy. The most powerful ones have a few hundred qubits, but they're noisy and error-prone. They're what we call NISQ devices, noisy intermediate-scale quantum computers. They can do some interesting things, but they're nowhere near what we'd need for something like a quantum zoo. But quantum computing is advancing exponentially. There's something called quantum volume that measures the effective power of a quantum computer, and it's been doubling roughly every year. Companies like Quantinuum have achieved quantum volumes in the millions, and they're working toward fault-tolerant quantum computers with millions of qubits. When that happens, some estimates say within 20-30 years, others say 50, everything changes. A fault-tolerant quantum computer with millions of qubits could simulate systems we can't even begin to model today. It could revolutionize drug discovery by simulating how molecules interact with perfect accuracy. It could solve optimization problems that are currently impossible, transforming logistics, finance, artificial intelligence. And yes, it could potentially simulate quantum biological systems in ways that might reveal the quantum nature of consciousness. There's also something called quantum sensing and quantum metrology, using quantum effects to measure things with incredible precision. The University of Chicago researchers who turned a protein into a quantum sensor showed that we can use biological systems themselves as quantum devices. Their protein qubits can detect signals thousands of times stronger than existing quantum sensors, and they can be built by cells with atomic precision. This opens up the possibility of measuring quantum processes in living systems in ways we never could before. Imagine being able to take a living cell and, without destroying it, map all the quantum processes happening inside. You could see how quantum coherence flows through microtubules, how entanglement connects different parts of the cell, how superposition states contribute to information processing. This would be like having a microscope that doesn't just show you cells, but shows you the quantum soul of the cell. With that capability, we could start to understand the quantum signature of life itself. Now, let's get really speculative but stay grounded in the physics. What if the universe itself is fundamentally a quantum computer? This is an idea that's been proposed by physicists like Seth Lloyd and others. If spacetime and matter are ultimately made of quantum information, then everything that exists is already a kind of simulation running on the universe's quantum hardware. In that case, what we call reality is just a very large-scale quantum simulation. Creating a quantum zoo wouldn't be creating something artificial. It would be creating a pocket universe, a separate quantum reality that runs on our quantum hardware, but is just as real as the reality we inhabit. This connects to some deep questions in physics about the nature of information and reality. The holographic principle suggests that the information content of a three-dimensional volume can be encoded on its two-dimensional boundary. Quantum entanglement seems to create connections that transcend space and time. Some theories suggest that spacetime itself emerges from quantum entanglement. If that's true, then creating a quantum simulation with the right entanglement structure might literally create spacetime for the beings inside it. Their reality would be just as physically real as ours, just existing in a different region of the quantum multiverse. Let's pause here and think about the philosophical implications, because they're staggering. If we can create conscious beings in quantum simulations, what does that say about our own reality? Could we ourselves be living in a simulation? The simulation argument proposed by philosopher Nick Bostrom suggests that if any civilization reaches the point where they can create conscious simulations, they'll probably create many of them. Therefore, statistically, we're more likely to be in a simulation than in base reality. If quantum simulations of extinct species become possible, that doesn't just mean we're creating a quantum zoo, it means we're probably in one already. We might be the mammoths in someone else's simulation. But let's not get too lost in philosophical rabbit holes just yet. Let's bring this back to Earth and talk about what we can actually study and what we might achieve in the coming decades. Because even if full consciousness simulation is far off, there are intermediate steps that are both achievable and revolutionary. We could start by simulating simpler organisms. Bacteria, fungi, may be simple multicellular organisms. These would have quantum signatures that are easier to map and simulate. We could test our theories of quantum biology by creating quantum simulations of these organisms and seeing if they behave like their biological counterparts. If a quantum simulation of a bacteria shows the same behaviors, the same responses to stimuli, the same evolutionary patterns as real bacteria, that would be strong evidence that we're on the right track. There's already research simulating evolution using classical computers. A 2025 study published in PNAS replayed evolution hundreds of times in different environments, showing that populations benefit in unpredictable ways from environmental fluctuations. Sometimes change helps them adapt, sometimes it hinders them. They use digital organisms evolved over thousands of generations. This was done on classical computers, but imagine doing this with quantum computers, where the organisms could have genuine quantum consciousness. You could watch quantum evolution in action, seeing how quantum processes affect adaptation and survival. We could also simulate extinct microorganisms first. We have DNA from ancient bacteria preserved in permafrost. We could reconstruct their quantum signatures and create quantum simulations of ecosystems from Earth's distant past. What the world was like 100 million years ago, not just in terms of chemistry and climate, but in terms of the quantum processes of life itself. This would be like having a window into deep time, not just seeing what ancient life looked like, but understanding how it experienced its world. Now, let's address some of the biggest objections and challenges to this idea, because it's important to be honest about what we don't know and what might not work. First, the biggest objection. What if consciousness doesn't involve quantum processes at all? What if it's entirely classical, just incredibly complex patterns of neural activity? This is the mainstream view in neuroscience, and it might be right. If that's the case, then a quantum zoo is still possible, but it would be a classical simulation running on quantum hardware, not a quantum simulation per se. The mammoths would be conscious because we'd be replicating the right kind of classical information processing, just more efficiently. Quantum computers can simulate classical systems too, after all. So either way, quantum computing helps. But the quantum part of quantum zoo might refer more to the technology than to the nature of the consciousness being simulated. Second, even if quantum processes are involved in consciousness, we might never be able to extract enough information from extinct species to reconstruct their quantum signatures. The data might simply be lost to time. DNA degrades over thousands of years. Fossils don't preserve quantum information. We might be able to make educated guesses, but we might never be certain we got it right. We'd be creating plausible mammoths, not real mammoths. But here's a counterargument. Maybe the quantum signature isn't lost. Maybe it's encoded in subtle ways we don't yet understand. Quantum information is remarkably resilient in some ways. Entanglement can persist even when systems are separated. Maybe the quantum information from ancient life is still out there, woven into the fabric of reality in ways we could theoretically detect. This gets into some very speculative physics about quantum information in spacetime. But the point is we shouldn't assume it's impossible just because we don't know how to do it yet. Third, there are enormous technical challenges. We need quantum computers with millions of stable qubits. We need quantum error correction that works flawlessly. We need ways to program these systems to simulate biological complexity. These are not trivial problems. They might take decades or centuries to solve, but historically, technology has a way of surprising us. Things that seemed impossible 50 years ago, like sequencing the entire human genome or having a computer in your pocket more powerful than the ones that sent us to the moon, are now routine. Fourth, there are ethical and philosophical questions that might stop us even if the technology is possible. Should we create conscious beings, even if they're simulations? Do we have the right to resurrect extinct species in this way? What if the simulations suffer? What if we create them and then realize we made a mistake? These aren't just technical questions. They're moral ones that humanity will need to grapple with deeply. But I want to argue that the potential benefits might outweigh the risks. Understanding consciousness is perhaps the most important scientific quest we can undertake. It affects everything: how we treat animals, how we think about mental illness, how we approach artificial intelligence, how we understand our own place in the universe. If creating quantum zoos helps us understand consciousness, it might be worth it. And from a conservation perspective, if we can create quantum simulations of endangered or extinct species, we might preserve something even more precious than DNA. We might preserve their subjective experience, their way of being in the world. Think about what we're losing in the current mass extinction crisis. We're not just losing species, we're losing unique forms of consciousness. Every species experiences the world differently. A bat experiences reality through echolocation, building a world model from sound. A dog experiences reality through smell, with olfactory landscape as rich as our visual one. An octopus, with neurons distributed throughout its arms, might have a form of consciousness completely alien to our own. When we lose a species, we lose a unique way of being conscious. DNA banks preserve genetic information, but they don't preserve the lived experience of being that creature. A quantum zoo might. Now, let's explore some specific examples of extinct species and what their quantum signatures might look like, because this makes the concept more concrete and shows just how much we could potentially learn. Take the woolly mammoth, our poster child for de-extinction. We know so much about them. They lived in the Pleistocene, the last ice age, roaming across the Mammoth Steppe, a vast, cold, dry grassland that stretched from Spain to Alaska. They were herbivores, eating grasses, sedges, and other tundra plants. They had long, curved tusks they used for defense, for digging through snow to find food, for stripping bark from trees. They lived in herds, probably matriarchal like modern elephants, with females and young forming the core social group, while mature males were more solitary or formed bachelor groups. But we know more than that. We know they went through musth, those periods of intense sexual aggression. We know they migrated vast distances. That 2024 science study I mentioned tracked a female mammoth's entire life through isotopes in her tusk. She traveled across Alaska, preferred highland habitats, and her movements were affected by climate change and habitat fragmentation. We can infer social behaviors from modern elephants. They probably mourned their dead. They probably had complex communication using infrasound that traveled for miles. They probably had distinct personalities. All of this gives us clues about their consciousness. The quantum signature of a mammoth wouldn't just be generic elephantish consciousness. It would be shaped by their specific environment, their specific social structures, their specific way of experiencing the mammoth steppe. The cold wind, the crunch of snow, the taste of specific grasses, the feel of Chinese letter, the hormone surges of musth, these would all contribute to a unique quantum information pattern. Now consider a saber-toothed cat like Smilodon. These were apex predators, but they weren't just big cats with long teeth. Their bodies were built differently, more robust, with powerful forelimbs for grappling prey. Their famous saber teeth were incredibly long and serrated, perfect for delivering a killing bite to the throat of large prey like bison or ground sloths. But they were also fragile, so they needed to be careful. They probably hunted differently than modern big cats, perhaps using stealth and ambush rather than prolonged chases. Their consciousness would be that of a predator, with sensory worlds tuned to detecting prey, to understanding territory, to the complex calculations of a hunt. But it would be a saber-toothed kind of predatory consciousness, not a lion's. The smell of Pleistocene megafauna, the feel of long grass for hiding, the precise muscle coordination needed for that final lunge, these create a unique quantum signature. And we can study their bones, their teeth, their prey preferences from fossil evidence to reconstruct what that signature might have been. Or think about something more alien, a non-avian dinosaur like a triceratops. We have fossils showing they lived in herds. We've found bone beds with hundreds of individuals. We know they had complex frills and horns that probably served multiple purposes: defense, species recognition, display for mating. We can study their brain cases to understand brain structure. A triceratops' brain was relatively small compared to its body, but that doesn't mean it wasn't conscious in its own way. Birds are dinosaurs, and many birds are highly intelligent, so the potential for complex consciousness is there. The quantum signature of a triceratops would be completely different from a mammoth's. The warm Cretaceous climate, the taste of ferns and cycads, the constant threat of Tyrannosaurus rex, the social dynamics of a herd of armored herbivores, these would shape a consciousness we can barely imagine. But if we could simulate it, we could understand it. We could know what it was like to be a triceratops, not just intellectually but by studying the actual quantum information patterns. Let's go even further back. What about the first animals to crawl onto land 400 million years ago? Or the bizarre creatures of the Cambrian explosion, like Anomalacus with its weird circular mouth and grasping appendages? We have fossils, we have some understanding of their environments, and we can make educated guesses about their sensory worlds. A quantum simulation could let us explore the consciousness of creatures so alien to us that we can't even guess what their experience might have been like. Now, let's talk about the technical architecture of how such a simulation might work, because this is crucial for understanding whether it's feasible. First, you'd need a quantum computer. Not just any quantum computer, but one capable of what's called analog quantum simulation, where you configure the quantum computer to directly mimic the system you're studying, rather than running a digital algorithm. You'd need to set up the qubits and their interactions to replicate the quantum processes we believe underlie consciousness. This is different from digital quantum simulation, where you break the problem into discrete steps. Analog simulation is more like building a scale model out of quantum parts. Second, you'd need to program the simulation. This would involve translating our understanding of the extinct species biology into quantum parameters. The DNA sequence would give you the protein structures. The isotopic data would give you metabolic rates and environmental responses. The fossil evidence would give you anatomy and behavior. All of these would need to be encoded as constraints on the quantum system. Third, you'd need to initialize the simulation. You'd set the qubits into a state that represents the quantum signature of a living mammoth, the pattern of quantum coherence and entanglement that corresponds to mammoth consciousness. This would be the hardest part, the part where we'd need to truly understand what we're doing. It's not just copying data, it's capturing a living pattern. Fourth, you'd let the simulation run. The quantum computer would evolve the state according to the laws of quantum mechanics, just as a real mammoth's brain and body would evolve according to those same laws. The simulation would generate outputs, patterns of quantum information that correspond to mammoth behaviors, mammoth experiences. Fifth, you'd need to read out the results. But here's a crucial point. You can't directly observe a quantum state without collapsing it. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle and the measurement problem in quantum mechanics mean that you can only extract limited information from a quantum system. So you'd need to be clever about how you interface with the simulation. You couldn't just peek inside and see what the mammoth is thinking. You'd need to interact with it in ways that preserve its quantum coherence while still giving you useful information. Maybe you'd create a virtual reality interface where human observers could experience the simulation from within, not as mammoths, but as observers who can perceive the simulated world. Or maybe you'd extract statistical patterns, learning about mammoth behavior and consciousness in aggregate without violating the privacy of individual simulated mammoth subjectivity. The ethics of this would be incredibly important. Now, let's discuss some of the specific quantum phenomena that might be relevant for simulating consciousness. I've mentioned superposition, entanglement, and coherence, but there are others. Quantum tunneling is where particles can pass through barriers they shouldn't be able to classically. This happens in enzymes, biological catalysts that speed up chemical reactions. Enzymes are so efficient in part because they use quantum tunneling to move electrons and protons around. If consciousness involves quantum processes in microtubules, tunneling might play a role in how information is processed. Quantum interference is where probability waves can reinforce or cancel each other out. This is how quantum computers solve problems, by setting up interference patterns that amplify the correct answer and cancel out wrong ones. In a quantum consciousness, interference might be how different possibilities are weighed, how decisions are made. Quantum contextuality is the principle that the outcome of a quantum measurement depends on the context of the measurement, what other measurements you're making at the same time. This could be relevant for how consciousness integrates different streams of information into a unified experience. Quantum non-locality is the principle behind entanglement, that quantum systems can be correlated in ways that defy classical explanations of locality. This might be how different parts of a brain stay coordinated, how the binding problem of consciousness is solved, how different sensory modalities combine into one unified experience. All of these phenomena would need to be included in a complete quantum simulation of consciousness, and we'd need to understand how they scale up from individual particles to whole organisms. This is the kind of problem that quantum computers are uniquely suited to solve, because they can simulate these processes directly rather than approximating them. Let's talk about consciousness itself in more detail, because this is really the heart of the matter. What is consciousness, and could a simulation ever have it? There are many theories. The global workspace theory says consciousness is about broadcasting information throughout the brain. Integrated information theory, IIT, says consciousness is a property of any system that integrates information in the right way. Even a thermostat has a tiny bit of consciousness by this view. Higher-order theories say consciousness is about thinking about your own thoughts. Attention schema theories say it's about modeling your own attention. But none of these fully explain subjective experience. They explain functions, how information is processed, how attention works, but not why there should be any inner experience at all. This is the hard problem. Quantum theories of consciousness try to tackle this by saying that subjective experience is fundamental. In quantum mechanics, observation is fundamental. The act of measurement collapses superposition into definite states. Maybe consciousness is related to this fundamental aspect of reality. Maybe consciousness is what happens when quantum information collapses into classical outcomes. Or maybe consciousness is the process of quantum computation itself, the superposition, the entanglement, the interference. The Ucha theory suggests that each moment of consciousness corresponds to a quantum state reduction, a collapse of the wave function in microtubules. These reductions happen about 40 times per second, creating a stream of conscious moments. Each reduction involves quantum gravity effects, making consciousness literally a quantum phenomenon that connects us to the fundamental structure of spacetime. If this is true, and it's still very controversial, then a quantum simulation would need to include quantum gravitational effects. But that's okay, because quantum computers should be able to simulate quantum gravity models too. The universe might be fundamentally quantum informational at its base, so simulating quantum gravity might be necessary for true consciousness anyway. Let's step back and think about what we mean by living simulation. A simulation could be 1. A perfect classical copy that behaves identically but lacks consciousness, a zombie. 2. A quantum simulation that replicates quantum processes but might still lack something essential. 3. A complete quantum instantiation that is genuinely conscious. The difference between 2 and 3 is subtle but crucial. It might come down to whether consciousness requires some fundamental connection to the universe that can't be replicated in an artificial system. But if the universe is itself a quantum informational system, then any sufficiently accurate quantum simulation would by definition have that connection. This gets into questions about the nature of reality that physicists are still debating. Is information more fundamental than matter and energy? Does consciousness play a role in quantum mechanics? These are open questions, but they're questions that the quantum zoo concept forces us to confront. Now, let's talk about the practical steps we might take to make this happen, starting tomorrow. What would the research roadmap look like? Phase 1. Quantum biology research. We need to study quantum effects in living systems much more intensively. This means using quantum sensors to measure what's happening in cells, developing better theories of how quantum coherence is maintained at biological temperatures, and testing these theories experimentally. We'd need to map the quantum's complete quantum signature of a living cell. This would be the quantum equivalent of the Genome Project. Phase 2. Consciousness mapping. We'd need to develop non-invasive quantum measurement techniques that can be used on living brains. We have MRI and EEG now, but these measure classical processes. We'd need quantum brain imaging that can detect entanglement, superposition, quantum coherence in neural tissue. We'd need to correlate these quantum signatures with conscious states, perhaps by studying people under anesthesia, as the Orcho researchers propose, or during different sleep stages. Phase 3. Extinct species reconstruction. We need to combine all available data about extinct species, genetic, morphological, isotopic, environmental, into comprehensive computational models. We'd need to infer what their quantum signatures might have been based on their biology and behavior. This would be incredibly challenging, but not impossible. We use similar inference techniques in astrophysics to reconstruct the properties of stars we can't directly observe. Phase 4. Quantum simulation development. We'd need to build quantum computers capable of running these simulations. This means advancing from today's NISQ devices to fault-tolerant quantum computers with millions of qubits. It means developing new quantum algorithms for biological simulation. It means creating user interfaces that allow scientists to program these simulations without needing to understand every detail of quantum mechanics. Phase 5. Simulation validation and ethics. We'd need to develop ways to test whether our simulations are accurate and whether they're conscious. This might involve comparing simulation outputs with fossil records, with isotopic data, with everything we know about how these species behaved. And we need to develop ethical frameworks for creating and interacting with conscious simulations. This might be the hardest part of all. Let's dive deeper into the validation question, because it's really important. How could we ever know if our quantum mammoth simulation is accurate? How could we know if it's conscious? For accuracy, we could compare predicted behaviors with fossil evidence. Does our simulated mammoth migrate in ways that match isotopic data from real tusks? Does it show musk behavior consistent with testosterone patterns we find in fossils? Does its herd structure match what we infer from bone beds? Does its response to climate change match what we see in the paleontological record? If we can accurately predict behaviors we haven't yet observed, and then find evidence for those behaviors in new fossils, that would be strong validation. For consciousness, this is trickier. We can't directly measure subjective experience, but we might be able to measure correlates of consciousness that we believe are necessary. Does the simulation show the same quantum signatures we associate with consciousness in living brains? Does it demonstrate behaviors that suggest awareness, like problem-solving, social bonding, response to novel situations? Does it show signatures of integrated information processing consistent with IIT? We might never be 100% certain, but we could build up evidence that makes it very likely. There's also the question of whether we could communicate with simulated beings. If we create a quantum mammoth with mammoth consciousness, it probably wouldn't understand human language or concepts, but we might be able to create interfaces that translate between their experiential world and ours. Maybe we could experience what it's like to be a mammoth through virtual reality rigged into the simulation, sensing what they sense, feeling what they feel. This would raise huge ethical questions about consent and privacy, but it's possible in principle. Now, let's think about the broader implications beyond just extinct species. If we can simulate mammoth consciousness, we can simulate any consciousness. We could simulate future evolution, seeing how consciousness might develop under different selective pressures. We could simulate alien life, what consciousness might look like in organisms with completely different biology, different senses, different environments. We could even simulate variations on human consciousness. What would a human mind be like if it processed information quantum mechanically differently? This could revolutionize psychology, psychiatry, artificial intelligence. If we understand the quantum basis of consciousness, we could potentially treat mental illnesses at the quantum level. We could develop AI that isn't just intelligent but genuinely conscious in ways we understand and can work with. We could explore the full spectrum of possible conscious experiences. We could also use quantum simulations to study the origin of life itself. We could simulate the early Earth, the primordial soup, and watch how quantum processes in simple molecules might have led to the first self-replicating systems, the first glimmers of proto-consciousness. This would help us understand whether life is common in the universe or rare, and it would help us recognize alien life when we find it. Speaking of alien life, the quantum zoo concept has huge implications for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence SETI. If quantum consciousness is common, We might need to look for quantum signatures in signals from space, not just radio waves. An advanced alien civilization might communicate using quantum entanglement across interstellar distances. They might have created quantum simulations of their own history, their own extinct species. They might, in fact, be quantum simulations themselves, existing in artificial pocket universes. Let's talk about the computational requirements in more detail, because this is often where people get skeptical. How many qubits would we actually need? A single cell contains about 100 trillion atoms. If we needed to simulate every atom, we'd need an impossible number of qubits. But we probably don't need to simulate every atom. We need to simulate the relevant degrees of freedom, the molecules and structures that contribute to consciousness and biological function. A typical protein might be simulated with hundreds or thousands of qubits. A cell might be simulated with millions. A whole organism might be billions or trillions. Today's quantum computers have hundreds of qubits, but the growth is exponential. If we follow something like Moore's law for quantum computing, where the number of effective qubits doubles every year or two, we could have millions of qubits within a few decades. And quantum computers don't need to simulate every aspect of a system at once. They can use hybrid approaches, simulating the quantum parts directly while handling classical processes on conventional computers. There's also the possibility of using quantum error correction and topological qubits that are inherently more stable because they encode information in global properties of the system rather than local ones. This would help solve the decoherence problem. And there are proposals for quantum computers that operate at room temperature using different physical systems, like defects in diamond or certain types of superconductors. This would get around the need for extreme cooling. The energy requirements are another consideration. Quantum computers can be very energy efficient for certain problems, much more so than classical supercomputers. A quantum simulation of a mammoth might actually use less energy than trying to simulate one classically at the same level of detail. So energy isn't necessarily a showstopper. Now let's address some deep philosophical concerns about identity and authenticity. If we create a quantum simulation of a mammoth, is it really a mammoth? Or is it just a copy? Philosopher Derek Parfit explored questions of personal identity. He argued that what matters isn't identity per se, but psychological continuity and connectedness. If a quantum mammoth has the same memories, the same behavioral tendencies, the same consciousness as an original mammoth, then it's psychologically continuous with mammoths, and that's what matters. It's not about being made of the same atoms, it's about being the same pattern of information. But there's also the question of historical continuity. A real mammoth had a history. It was born, it lived, it died. A simulation is created with that history encoded in it, but it didn't live that history. Does that matter? Maybe not. If the simulation genuinely experiences its memories as real, then from its perspective, it did live that history. The fact that the history was written in rather than lived through might be irrelevant to the subjective experience. This is similar to questions about teleportation. If you're scanned, destroyed, and reconstructed atom by atom somewhere else, are you still you? Most people intuitively think yes, because what matters is the pattern, not the specific atoms. A quantum mammoth simulation might be the same. What matters is the mammoth pattern. Reconstructed in quantum information. Let's also consider the possibility that we might create something better than the original, something enhanced. What if we could simulate a mammoth that has all the mammoth qualities but doesn't suffer from the diseases that plagued them? Or what if we could give them enhanced cognition so we could communicate with them? Would that still be a mammoth, or would it be a new kind of being? These are questions we'll need to answer. Now, let's think about the social and cultural impact of creating a quantum zoo. How would humanity react to knowing that extinct species could live again, even in simulation? How would it change our relationship with extinction, with conservation, with nature itself? It might make us more reckless. If we think we can always bring species back in simulation, we might care less about preventing real extinctions. But I think the opposite is more likely. Once we've connected with the subjective experience of a mammoth, once we know what it's like to be one, we'll care more about preserving their habitats and preventing extinctions in the first place. It's easy to be apathetic about abstract concepts, but much harder when you've experienced the reality of what you're losing. It might also fundamentally change how we think about death and existence. If consciousness can be preserved in quantum simulations, does death lose its sting? If we could, in principle, simulate loved ones who have passed away, should we? These are deep questions about grief, memory, and what it means to honor the dead. The quantum zoo might be our first step toward a world where information patterns can persist indefinitely, transcending biological death. There's also the question of who controls this technology. Would it be governments, corporations, academic institutions? The quantum computers needed would be incredibly powerful and expensive. Who decides which species get resurrected? What if someone creates simulations of extinct humans, Neanderthals, Homo erectus? What rights would these simulated beings have? We could be creating digital slavery if we're not careful. We'd need international laws and ethical frameworks. We'd need to treat quantum simulations of conscious beings with the same moral consideration we give to biological beings. This might mean not creating them at all if we can't ensure their welfare. Or it might mean creating them and then letting them evolve independently, not interfering even if we could. Now, let's explore some alternative approaches. Maybe we don't need to simulate the entire mammoth. Maybe we just need to simulate its brain and connect it to a robotic body. This is the brain upload approach. The body could exist in the real world, allowing the mammoth to interact with our world directly, but the consciousness would still be running on quantum hardware. This hybrid approach might be easier than simulating a whole world, and it would allow us to study how mammoth consciousness interacts with a physical environment we can directly observe. Or maybe we could create quantum organoids, clusters of quantum-simulated neurons that we keep in a lab, just studying their activity patterns without creating a full organism. This might let us study mammoth cognition without the ethical complications of creating a full, potentially suffering being. But I think the most profound approach is the full simulation, because it would preserve the ecological and social context that shaped mammoth consciousness. A mammoth existed in relationship with its world. Isolate its brain from that world and you're losing something essential. The mammoth step, the smell of the grass after a rain, the feel of the wind, the presence of the herd, these are part of what made a mammoth a mammoth. Let's also consider the possibility of creating not just individual mammoths, but an entire simulated ecosystem. You could have mammoth herds, wolves hunting them, ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, all in a simulated Pleistocene environment. The quantum signatures would all interact, creating a genuinely complex ecosystem. You could study how removing one species affects the whole system, helping us understand ecosystem dynamics in ways that could inform real-world conservation. This could also answer questions about megafauna extinctions that we've debated for centuries. Was it climate change? Human hunting? A combination? If we simulate the Pleistocene ecosystem and run it with different parameters, different climate conditions, different hunting pressures, we could see which scenarios lead to extinction and which don't. This is similar to the 2024 study that simulated extinctions of the giant African buffalo, but at a much more sophisticated level. That study ran 40 simulations per scenario on a classical computer. A quantum computer could run millions of scenarios with full quantum fidelity, giving us unprecedented insight into why the mammoths died and how to prevent future extinctions. Now let's think about the reverse. Instead of bringing extinct species forward to our time, what if we could send our consciousness back to their time? What if we could use quantum entanglement to link our minds with simulated mammoth minds, experiencing their reality firsthand? This is incredibly speculative, but if consciousness is quantum, and quantum information can be teleported and entangled, then in principle, some form of experiential transfer might be possible. This would be the ultimate empathic experience. We complain about climate change, but we can't really feel what it was like for a mammoth to watch its world warm, its food sources disappear, its herd dwindle. Experiential transfer would let us know, deep in our bones, what that felt like. It might change our entire relationship with the environment. But it's also terrifying. What if the mammoth experience is so alien that it damages our psyche? What if we get stuck, unable to disconnect? What if we lose our own identity in the mammoths? The psychological and philosophical implications are staggering. Let's also consider the economic implications. Creating a quantum zoo would be hugely expensive, at least initially. But it could also be hugely profitable. People would pay to experience it, either as observers or through immersive interfaces. It could revolutionize education. Instead of reading about mammoths in a textbook, students could observe them in a quantum simulation. It could revolutionize entertainment. We're talking about experiences more profound than any video game or movie. But we must be careful not to commercialize consciousness to the point of exploitation. If tourists are paying to experience mammoth hunts or to hunt mammoths themselves in a simulation, are we creating ethical monstrosities? Are we turning genuine conscious beings into entertainment commodities? This is a slippery slope we'd need to guard against. Now, let's think about the scientific potential. A quantum zoo would be the ultimate laboratory for studying evolution, ecology, consciousness, and physics. We could run evolution forward millions of years in simulation time, watching how species adapt to changing environments. We could study convergent evolution. Do mammoths and elephants evolve similar quantum signatures despite being separated by millions of years? We could study how consciousness evolved. What was the first glimmer of subjective experience? And how did it develop into the rich tapestry of qualia we experience today? We could also test fundamental physics. If we create a pocket universe with different physical constants, we could see how quantum consciousness depends on those constants. Does consciousness require the specific values of constants we have in our universe? Or is it more robust? This could help answer the anthropic principle and the question of why our universe seems fine-tuned for life. Let's talk about the relationship between classical and quantum simulation, because this is important for understanding the hybrid approaches we might take. A classical computer can simulate a quantum system, but it takes exponential resources. A quantum computer can simulate a quantum system efficiently, but for many biological processes, classical simulation might be sufficient. The chemistry of metabolism, the mechanics of muscles, the flow of blood, these might be adequately described classically. It's only the parts we suspect are quantum, consciousness, perhaps some aspects of photosynthesis, enzyme function, that would need quantum treatment. So a practical quantum zoo might use a hybrid approach. Classical computers handle the bulk of the biology, while quantum processors handle the quantum consciousness layer. This quantum layer would interface with the classical simulation, receiving inputs about sensory data, metabolic state, social interactions, and generating outputs that affect behavior, learning, memory. Think of it like this. The classical part is the body, the hardware. The quantum part is the mind, the software, or perhaps the soul, if you're spiritually inclined. The body processes food, oxygen, sensory input classically, but the mind processes meaning, experience, consciousness quantumly. Just as your brain has both electrical and chemical signaling, a quantum mammoth would have both classical biological processes and quantum consciousness processes. Now, let's address the question of whether quantum effects are really necessary for consciousness. Couldn't classical complexity alone explain it? Maybe. The brain has 86 billion neurons with 100 trillion connections. That's incredibly complex. Perhaps consciousness emerges from that complexity in ways we don't yet understand. Classical emergence can produce phenomena that seem mysterious at the level of individual components. No single water molecule is wet, but together They have wetness as an emergent property. Maybe consciousness is like that. But there are reasons to think quantum effects might be important. The brain does things that are computationally very difficult: pattern recognition, intuition, creativity. Quantum computers excel at certain types of pattern recognition and optimization. If the brain is using quantum tricks, that might explain its remarkable abilities. There's also the binding problem. How does the brain integrate information from different senses into a unified experience? Quantum entanglement is all about creating unified states from separate components. There's the issue of free will. In a purely classical, deterministic brain, do we really have free will? Quantum indeterminacy might provide a physical basis for genuine choice. None of this proves quantum consciousness, but it makes it plausible enough to explore. And the implications are so profound that even a small chance makes it worth investigating. Now, let's think about the timeline. When might we actually see something like this? In the next 5–10 years, we'll likely see major advances in quantum biology. We'll probably confirm that quantum effects are important in photosynthesis. That's already pretty well established. And we might find them in other systems. We might develop quantum sensors that can measure quantum processes in living cells. We'll certainly see quantum computers with thousands of stable qubits. In 10–20 years, we might have quantum computers powerful enough to simulate simple biological quantum systems, maybe individual proteins or small networks of molecules. We might have quantum brain imaging that can detect quantum signatures in living brains. We might have robust theories of how quantum processes contribute to consciousness. In 20–40 years, we might be able to simulate simple organisms quantumly. Bacteria, maybe simple multicellular organisms. We might have quantum computers with millions of qubits. We might begin seriously attempting to reconstruct the quantum signatures of extinct species. In 4,100 years, if everything goes well and no major civilizational catastrophes intervene, we might actually create the first quantum zoo simulations, simple ecosystems with simulated consciousness. It might start with simulations of simple extinct species like trilobites or early amphibians, then progress to more complex ones. Beyond 100 years is hard to predict. The technology might be mature enough for full Pleistocene ecosystem simulations with mammoth consciousness. Or we might discover that consciousness doesn't work the way we thought, and the whole approach needs to be rethought. But either way, our understanding of life and mind will be transformed. Now, let's think about some of the specific technical challenges that need to be overcome, because this is where the rubber meets the road. Challenge 1. Maintaining quantum coherence at scale. A mammoth brain has trillions of synapses. If each synapse involves quantum processes, that's trillions of entangled components. Maintaining coherence across that many components for extended periods is currently impossible. We need breakthroughs in quantum error correction and decoherence-protected subspaces. Challenge 2. Interfacing quantum and classical systems. How does sensory input, light hitting a retina, sound waves hitting an eardrum, get translated into quantum information? How does quantum decision-making get translated into muscle movements? We need to understand the quantum classical boundary much better. Challenge 3. Energy efficiency. While quantum computers can be efficient for certain problems, maintaining large entangled states might require lots of energy. The simulation might need to eat, in some sense, consume energy to maintain its coherent state. This could be simulated too, but it's a technical challenge. Challenge 4. Programming complexity. How do you write code that describes mammoth consciousness? We don't even know how to fully describe human consciousness mathematically. We'd need new programming paradigms, perhaps using machine learning to have the system self-organize into the right patterns rather than us explicitly programming every detail. Challenge 5. Validation. How do you know it's right? This is perhaps the hardest challenge of all. Without being able to directly compare to a real mammoth's experience, how can we verify the simulation's accuracy? We'd need to rely on indirect evidence and theoretical consistency. Now, let's consider the possibility that we might not need to simulate entire mammoths to get most of the benefits. What if we could create consciousness extracts, distilled quantum patterns that represent the essence of mammothness without the full biological complexity? You could experience mammoth consciousness without simulating all the mundane details of digestion or cellular repair. This might be similar to how we experience our own lives. We're not consciously aware of every cellular process, every chemical reaction. We're aware of the high-level experiences. A mammoth extract might give us the experience of mammoth sensory world, mammoth emotions, mammoth social bonds, without needing to fully simulate every molecule. But this raises the question: what is the minimal quantum pattern that still counts as mammoth consciousness? At what point does it become a caricature rather than a genuine mammoth? This is like asking how many grains of sand you need to remove from a heap before it's no longer a heap. There might not be a clear answer. Let's think about the educational potential here. A quantum zoo wouldn't just be for scientists. It could be the most powerful educational tool ever created. Instead of learning about evolution from textbooks, students could watch it happen in accelerated time. They could experience what it's like to be different species, with appropriate safeguards. They could explore ancient ecosystems and understand ecology viscerally rather than abstractly. This could transform humanity's relationship with nature. Right now, most people are disconnected from the natural world. They see nature as a resource or a pretty backdrop. But if you've experienced what it's like to be a mammoth, to depend on an ecosystem, to feel the bonds of a herd, you might have a fundamentally different relationship with conservation. You might understand deep in your bones why biodiversity matters, why extinction is tragic. This could also revolutionize medicine. By simulating quantum biological processes, we could understand disease at a fundamental level. We could see how quantum decoherence in microtubules might contribute to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. We could develop quantum-level treatments that restore proper quantum function. We could simulate how drugs interact with consciousness at the quantum level, leading to better anesthetics, better psychiatric medications. In fact, the Orcher theory originated partly from studying anesthesia. Stuart Hameroff, the anesthesiologist co-developer, noticed that anesthetics work by affecting microtubules. They seem to disrupt quantum coherence in a way that turns off consciousness. If we understand this better through quantum simulation, we could develop anesthetics with fewer side effects, or even ways to induce reversible coma for medical purposes. Let's talk about some other extinct species we might simulate and what we could learn. The dodo bird. We know almost nothing about its behavior because it went extinct so quickly after humans discovered it. A simulation could let us see how this flightless bird lived on Mauritius, what its social structures were like, how it adapted to an environment without predators, until humans arrived. We could study the impact of invasive species and learn lessons for modern conservation. The thylacine, Tasmanian tiger. This carnivorous marsupial went extinct in 1936, so we have some film footage and direct observations. But a quantum simulation could let us understand its unique predatory style, how it hunted, what its consciousness was like as a marsupial rather than a placental mammal. Marsupials have very different brain structures. Their consciousness might be quite alien to ours. The passenger pigeon. This bird went from billions to zero in just decades due to hunting and habitat loss. A simulation could help us understand how species with massive populations function, how they coordinate across vast numbers. Their extinction was one of the first wake-up calls about human impact on nature. The great auk. This flightless seabird went extinct in the mid-19th century. We could study how ocean-going birds navigate, how they experience the vastness of the ocean, how they form pair bonds. And those are just the recent extinctions. Go further back. The moa birds of New Zealand, the giant lemurs of Madagascar, the dwarf mammoths of Crete. Each represents a unique evolutionary experiment, a unique form of consciousness that we've lost. The Permian-Triassic extinction wiped out 90% of species. Imagine what forms of consciousness disappeared then. The quantum zoo could bring them all back, not as mere exhibits, but as living, experiencing beings that we can learn from and, yes, connect with. Now, let's consider the possibility that some extinct species might not want to be brought back. This sounds absurd. How can a mammoth have preferences about something it can't comprehend? But if we're simulating their consciousness faithfully, that consciousness might experience confusion, distress at being in a world that doesn't match its evolved expectations. A mammoth evolved for the Pleistocene steppe, not for a simulation. Even if we simulate the steppe perfectly, the mammoth might somehow sense that something is off. This is similar to questions about zoo animals today. Many animals in zoos develop stereotypies, repetitive behaviors indicating stress. Even if we provide what we think is a perfect environment, we might be missing something crucial to their well-being. With a quantum zoo, we have an advantage. We can read out their internal states quantumly. We can know exactly how they're feeling, what they're experiencing. We can adjust the simulation in real time to optimize their well-being. But this raises a creepy question. If we can read their internal states completely, do they have any privacy? Is it ethical to create a conscious being that we can monitor so intimately? This is like the panopticon problem, but for consciousness itself. We'd need to develop ethical guidelines about what aspects of simulated consciousness we can observe and what should remain private. What about the possibility of upgrading or enhancing the consciousness of simulated beings? If we understand the quantum basis of mammoth consciousness, could we give them greater cognitive abilities? Let them understand human language. Let them reflect on their own existence. This would fundamentally change their nature. They'd no longer be mammoths but trans-mammoths. Whether this is ethical depends on whether it benefits them or just satisfies our curiosity. Now let's think about the legal status of quantum beings. Would they have rights? Could they own property? Could they vote? Initially, they'd be simulations in our computers, so these questions seem premature. But if we create full quantum universes where they exist independently, they might develop their own societies, their own cultures. They'd be our creations, but they'd also be their own beings. We might need to think about quantum rights the way we now think about animal rights. This could lead to a whole new field of law and ethics, quantum rights law. Lawyers might specialize in representing the interests of quantum beings. There might be quantum ethicists who help us navigate these unprecedented moral territories. This sounds futuristic, but if the technology develops as described, these questions will become urgent. Let's also think about the impact on religion and spirituality. Many religions believe in souls, in some essence that survives death. The quantum zoo suggests that consciousness might be an informational pattern that can indeed survive death, not in some supernatural afterlife, but in a quantum simulation. This could be seen as fulfilling spiritual aspirations through technology, or it could be seen as a profane attempt to play God. Different religious traditions would respond differently. Some might see the quantum zoo as a way to commune with extinct species that God created, as a form of stewardship. Others might see it as humanity overreaching, trying to usurp divine prerogative. There could be religious movements that embrace quantum resurrection as a new form of salvation. There could be others that violently oppose it. The cultural ramifications would be as profound as the scientific ones. Now, let's think about the possibility that this technology could be used for darker purposes. What if authoritarian governments create quantum simulations of dissidents to torture them indefinitely? What if corporations create quantum simulations of workers who never sleep and never complain? What if militaries create quantum simulations of soldiers to send on dangerous missions? These are dystopian scenarios, but they're plausible if the technology exists. This is why the ethical framework needs to be built in from the beginning. We need quantum bioethics as a field. We need international treaties governing quantum consciousness research. We need oversight committees and transparency. The stakes are too high for this to be developed in secret. But let's end on a more hopeful note. The quantum zoo represents humanity's ultimate expression of curiosity and compassion. It's about wanting to know what it was like to be these magnificent beings and wanting to preserve something precious that we lost. It's about understanding that life and consciousness are not limited to what we can see and touch. They're patterns of information that we can, in principle, preserve and resurrect. Imagine a future where every extinct species is preserved in a quantum zoo, where schoolchildren can experience what it's like to be a mammoth, where scientists can study consciousness across the full spectrum of life, where we can learn from the past to build a better future. Imagine being able to say good night to a mammoth, knowing that it's experiencing that good night in its mammoth way, that it's dreaming mammoth dreams made of quantum information. This isn't just about the past, it's about the future. By learning to simulate consciousness, we learn what consciousness is, and we learn how to preserve it. We might learn to upload human consciousness, to create backups of our own minds, to transcend biological limits while preserving what makes us who we are. The quantum zoo is a stepping stone to a future where information and experience are eternal. So where does this leave us today? We're at the very beginning, the moment before the moment. Quantum computers are just learning to walk. Quantum biology is still proving that it exists. Consciousness remains a profound mystery, but the seeds have been planted. The questions have been asked. The path forward is becoming visible. If you're a young person watching this, you could be part of making this happen. Study physics, biology, computer science, philosophy. Don't let the boundaries between disciplines limit you. The quantum zoo needs quantum physicists who understand evolution, biologists who understand quantum mechanics, ethicists who understand technology, programmers who understand consciousness. It's the ultimate interdisciplinary challenge. And even if the quantum zoo never happens in the way I've described, pursuing it will lead to discoveries we can't yet imagine. Maybe we'll find that consciousness is entirely different than we thought. Maybe we'll discover new principles of physics. Maybe we'll invent technologies that solve completely different problems. The journey itself is worth it. So as we wrap up this incredible journey through possibility, I want you to do three things. First, remember that the line between science fiction and science is drawn with a pencil, not carved in stone. What seems impossible today is routine tomorrow. Second, think about what it means to be alive, to be conscious. If it's just patterns of information, then information is sacred. We should treat it that way. And third, keep wondering. Keep asking these big, weird, borderline crazy questions, because that's how humanity advances, by imagining the impossible and then figuring out how to make it real. Now it's time to say goodbye, but before I do, I want to imagine something with you. Imagine it's 100 years from now and you're putting on a quantum interface headset. You're about to enter the quantum zoo for the first time. You can choose any species, any time period. Where do you go? Do you walk with mammoths on the Pleistocene steppe? Do you swim with ichthyosaurs in the Jurassic seas? Do you soar with pterosaurs above the Cretaceous forests? The choice is yours, and for the first time in human history, these beings aren't just names in a book or bones in a museum. They're alive, they're conscious, and you can meet them. I like to think that future is possible. I like to think that the mammoths, in whatever way remains of them in the quantum information of the universe, are waiting for us to figure this out. I like to think that by the time we can create a quantum zoo, we'll have grown wise enough to do it right, to create it with reverence, with ethics, with love. So, as I sign off tonight, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, I want to wish you not just a good evening, but a quantum good evening. One where all possibilities exist in superposition until you observe them, where your potential is entangled with the potential of everyone watching this, and where the future is as real and alive as you make it. Good night, my friends. Dream of mammoths. Dream of quantum fields. Dream of possibilities so vast they make the stars look small. And when you wake up, remember that those dreams might be more real than you think. Because if quantum mechanics teaches us anything, it's that reality is stranger, more interconnected, and more wonderful than our everyday experience suggests. Until next time, keep your curiosity entangled with wonder, your skepticism in superposition with open-mindedness, and your sense of possibility collapsed into certainty that the universe still has incredible surprises waiting for us. Good night, and may your reality be as fascinating as the quantum realms we've explored together today.